our last session deals with the Americas, and I guess in the excitement of Asia and the growth story that is Asia, we tend to forget that Australian trade with nations like the USA, for example, valued about $3 billion and a very important market, particularly for things like beef and wine. So we tend to forget that the US in particular, but North America more generally, is probably one of the most wealthy consumer markets in the world and a very important trading partner for Australia. And we were reminded in preparing for this conference that it's actually about the 10-year anniversary of the Australia-USA Free Trade Agreement. And so it's probably a good time to have some reflection on where that's taken us. And our speaker, our first speaker for this session, Hugh Maginnis, who's the Councillor for Agricultural Affairs Australia and New Zealand Embassy of the US here in Canberra, is a very good person to lead us in that discussion. He is the Agricultural Councillor here at the Embassy, but prior to that he was also the Director in the Office of Foreign Service Operations at the USDA, based in Washington, where he directed personnel and resources for the USA offices in 26 embassies throughout the Western Hemisphere. And I always think as you're walking down the mall in Washington and you look, depending on which way you're going, and you see there proudly and clearly the very strong Department of Agriculture that it's been the Department of Agriculture for I think 160 years, since created by Abraham Lincoln in about 1863, if my memory serves me correctly. Yet we in Australia seem to have a propensity to rename our departments of agriculture about every 6 months. So I always thought that was an interesting contrast. But and I think Hugh will also remind us that trade's a two-way street. So we'll be interested to hear his comments. So please welcome Hugh Maginnis.
Thank you very much, Mick. And again, like everyone else, I just want to say thank you very much to the Farm Institute for sponsoring this wonderful program and giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about the United States as a market for Australia, but also perhaps to expand a little bit more, not just to talk about the US as a market, but also as a competitor with Australia, because, I mean, let's face it, Australia market opportunities in Asia and around the world are not only going to depend on your marketing and what your products, how you sell your products and how you market your products, but also on the competition. And of course, the US is out there as a competitor. So I'll take a little time and talk about that. But at the same time, I'd also maybe just like to talk a little bit more about farm policy, about TPP, and about all of those good issues that affect agricultural policy around the world, and particularly US producers, but also affect other countries internationally. So what I'll do is just start out by talking, and I'll figure out how to use this. Again, my outline of my presentation, I'll just give a quick overview of US agriculture, address a bit about the key elements of current farm policy and US policies in the context, as well as a US trade agenda. And again, you know, the US is one of the largest producers and exporters of ag products, but it is also one of the largest importers. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Again, here's the background on US agriculture. We have a pretty substantial and large farm sector. We have about 3.2 million farm operators. 87%, approximately, that number can be debated. 87 to 95% of farms are operated by families or individuals. 2.7 million hired farm workers, creating 13.9 million ag-related jobs. Our crop acreage right now is estimated at about 132 million hectares, and our value of production is estimated at about $363 billion. 5% of our farms account for 50% of production. So we do have a small number of large farms, should I say. Net farm income, $130 billion. And let's not forget that the population of the United States is large and growing. At last count, 325 million people. So there are a lot of mouths to feed, and generally a very high-income economy. So there are lots of opportunities for imports. Just a quick overview and scan of the market value of U.S. agriculture, and to let you know a little bit about where the productive areas are in the country. Again, agriculture is found in just about every state, in fact, every state in the United States. California is our largest producer, and if you follow that with Iowa, Texas, Nebraska, and Minnesota, and that rounds out the top 5 producers, which actually account for about 1/3 of total farm output in the United States. Looking at this chart, corn and oilseeds are our main U.S. crops, accounting for about $220 billion of sales. And again, you can see that corn is, again, one of the largest commodities that's produced in the United States, along with oilseed crops. But we, of course, produce a variety of just about every other crop in the United States. Livestock sales, same thing. We are a large producer of livestock and livestock products, totaling about $185 billion in 2003. Cattle and calves account for about 38%, as well as large proportion poultry, dairy, and hogs. And again, this is a chart of U.S. planted area for corn, wheat, soybeans, and upland cotton. And just a couple of notes about this chart. About 20 million more acres have been planted into corn and soybeans when compared to about a decade ago. And I'm sure as many of you realize, there's been quite a transformation in our productive capacity due to things like biofuels and the energy industry in the United States, which has basically allowed more corn and soybean planting in the United States. More corn, of course, is going to ethanol production. And a lot of that acreage has come out of wheat in the northern part of the country, as well as a lot of acreage out of our Conservation Reserve Program. I'm sure many of you are aware of that, but it's a program that basically pays producers to keep their acreage fallow or in conservation. And in the south, a lot of the acreage has come out of cotton, peanuts, rice, and rice acreage. So that's basically what you see on this chart. And it's interesting to note that our Farm Bill in 1996, which really emphasized a lot of planting flexibility, I think is a big rationale or reason for this chart, and because it promoted a lot of production flexibility and allowed more corn and soybean acreage to be planted while maintaining base acreage where our farmers derive some of their payments, program payments. This is a chart of farm level prices over the last decade, and obviously the prices have generally, for farmers, have generally gone up. Prices received have been pretty strong over the last decade. I think farm income has also been quite strong and stable in general. Just a couple of things to really note about this is that obviously the prices are, behind the strong prices are a lot of different things, but a lot of it's based on strong exports, which has been caused by a weaker dollar, at least until about a year ago, or a couple of years ago. Also, again, as I mentioned, demand for feed and higher use for energy like biofuels. And again, as you can see in this chart, we've had very strong livestock prices, especially over the last few years. As many of you are very much aware, given the position that Australia has in terms of beef exports to the United States, our herd is basically entering a rebuilding process. Our herd is essentially at a 63-year low, and there's been a lot of factors at play here, including drought, including heifers that have been retained and resulting drop in slaughter, which has basically caused prices to skyrocket. In fact, commercial beef output has dropped 5%, which is really the 4th straight year of decline in output. So right now, our beef production in the United States and our beef supply and demand is at a very important point in terms of Australia's position as a big supplier of beef into the United States. I let's see. So looking at agricultural output and input and total factor productivity, as you can see, agriculture has become extremely productive over the last 50 years or so. Really, we have about 2.2 million farms, and again, as I mentioned, 87 to 97% are family-owned. Farmers only comprise about 2% of the total population. And interesting figure, we have produced about 260% more food since 1950 in the United States, with a drop of 2% in inputs. So with 2% fewer inputs, we produced 260% more food since the 1950s. So obviously, yields for crops have increased dramatically, larger crop productivity. For animal and livestock production, you have better nutrition, better health, better productive technologies, and herd management for livestock. Many of you are probably aware of the drought situation in the United States, especially in California at this point, but also in Texas, although that's been alleviated to some extent over the last couple of weeks. There's been significant rainfall in Texas, and in fact, a lot of dramatic flooding that's occurred, but that has also alleviated the drought situation to some extent in Texas. But in California, this has been one of the worst droughts that we've had in the last century, and it's really causing a lot of difficulties and problems in California, not only in terms of agricultural production, but it's obviously a pretty dramatic political situation, and a lot of people pointing fingers and blaming in the environmentalist movement about the lack of water and the lack of storage capacity and not enough water for farmers. So that's an issue that is a real problem, and it's continuing, but hopefully we will get some water eventually. Here's our trade picture, essentially. Agriculture trade is obviously a very important part of our economy in the United States. We're an export powerhouse. Basically, all of our sectors export, most of which have a trade surplus. And we are big importers, but the majority of our imports I like to characterize as complementary. For example, as you look on the chart, a lot of imports in terms of sugar, cocoa, chocolate, again for Australia, wine, coffee, beer, rubber from tropical countries. Also vegetables and fruit, we're huge importers there. A lot of that is counter-seasonal, and in fact we have a very important counter-seasonal trade in horticultural products with Australia, so that's an important market for Australia. Now the only exception here that I'd like to definitely point out is beef. Right now, I mean, the beef market for Australia and the United States has been absolutely phenomenal. Last year, beef exports to the United States from Australia approached the $2 billion mark, which is a record, and accounts for about 1/3 of all of our beef imports in the United States, and that beef is from Australia, and so Australia has done very well in terms of from beef exports into the U.S. Here's U.S. exports as a share of our production. Again, just last year, in fact, exports reached a record of $150 billion, and it's due, of course, to a lot of factors, including global economic growth, a weaker dollar. We've had a weaker dollar, weaker U.S. dollar until about a year and a half ago, and that's certainly affected our export capacity. Growth globally, and as many of you have seen from the presentations today, a lot of enhanced diets from increased income, more protein, more consumer-oriented products, meat, dairy, high protein, fruits and vegetables. But as you can see, a lot of the exports of the horticultural products are in red here, and essentially those comprise a very large percentage of our production. So we're very export dependent on a lot of our horticultural type products. And of course, obviously China is the top destination for U.S. agricultural exports. China's actually overtaken some of our more traditional export markets, such as Canada and Japan. Of course, the factors behind this are pretty clear. China growing incomes and again shifting diets and higher incomes And it's interesting that it has overtaken our traditional large export markets of Japan and Canada. Just a quick look at U.S. foreign policy evolution. As Mick mentioned, the Department of Agriculture was essentially created back in the late 1800s during the administration of Abraham Lincoln. I think it was officially the Department of Agriculture was, there was a law called the Hatch Act that was passed in the very late 1800s. But essentially, the federal government really wasn't involved in agriculture to any significant extent until the 1930s, which of course is when we had the Great Depression and we had the Dust Bowl in the southern states. And essentially, global economies basically tanked, and we were quite dependent on our export markets in Europe, which basically tanked, and prices just fell through the floor. And at that point, the U.S. instituted, some supply control programs for the first time in the 1930s, as well as price supports. In the 1960s, we shifted that support somewhat, or we expanded it to more income support payments, which lasted until the 80s, where we introduced with our Farm Bill in the 1980s some marketing and production flexibility that I mentioned before that I think has helped in terms of giving farmers more planting flexibility and more variety and choice about what types of crops they plant. And then in the 1990s, we actually had some programs that decoupled payments from production decisions entirely, although those have been totally eliminated with our most recent Farm Bill. Here, a quick glance at Farm Bill, the titles of the Farm Bill. What I'd like to just note for the audience here is that, it's a very large, it's a very expensive Farm Bill, but as you can see, about 80% of the expenditures under this Farm Bill are for our domestic feeding programs or our food stamp program. A lot of people don't realize that, especially overseas. A lot of folks target programs like our commodity programs and our crop insurance programs, which affect international trade and have that effect. But as you can see, those particular titles only account for about 12% of our total Farm Bill expenditures. The majority is our domestic feeding program. Our trade policy agenda, just to encapsulate that, is that we are certainly actively seeking to open up world markets for all products, including agriculture and food. And of course, we believe, like Australia, more open markets will benefit farmers in both countries. And here's just an overview of simple average most favored nation applied agriculture tariffs. And this is an interesting pictorial to me, I think, because as you look at the USA, in compared to many other countries, you can see that our average applied tariff is rather low when you compare it to many other countries in the world. In fact, we're right down there with New Zealand, in fact, in our applied agriculture tariff. Now, Australia isn't on this picture, and I think that's mainly because of our free trade agreement, where basically all agriculture import tariffs were eliminated in Australia. Just a quick look at the NAFTA, our North American Free Trade Agreement, which for most people has been highly significant and highly beneficial to American farmers and Canadian farmers, and Mexican farmers for that matter. As you can see, this agreement has basically boosted trade among all three countries quite significantly. Again, just to reemphasize, the U.S. is also a major import market. Again, most of those products are complementary: tropical oils, rubber, coffee, and horticultural products. But again, Australia has a great market in the U.S. for beef. Again, looking at our trade policy and basically where it's evolved over the last 10 or 20 years, since the Uruguay round, which we believe was a very successful agreement, it put agriculture on a reform path and a reform agenda globally, but the second Doha round has not moved forward as quickly or as substantially as we would like it to have done. And so, like Australia, the United States led basically a switch to free trade agreements or bilateral free trade agreements or plurilateral agreements. And that's sort of the way we've been liberalizing trade over the last 10 or 15 years. And again, FTAs and the TPP, we believe, promises even greater market access through lower barriers. Here's just an overall scan of our FTAs, most of which are pending. And again, they're divided by pre-Doha, post-Doha, and currently under negotiation. And just to point out, we've made a lot of progress, in fact, since the Doha round in establishing and negotiating bilateral trade agreements with other countries, including Australia. And of course, the TPP is currently under negotiation, which is in the purple, but we're also negotiating a free trade agreement with Europe as well. Quick scan at the top 10 ag export markets. Again, China leads the way at this point, followed by Canada, Mexico, and Japan. And I guess what I'd like to point out here is that if you look at it, most of our largest export markets we've negotiated a free trade agreement, and we're hopeful, to negotiate others as well with Japan and the EU as part of the TPP and as part of the TTIP. Again, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which all of you are intimately familiar with, involved 12 countries. We're currently in the midst of trying to get trade promotion authority in the United States, which will allow essentially our Congress to vote up or down on any trade agreement that the administration negotiates. And this is, of course, is full of political intrigue at this point in time, but it's moving forward, and we're hopeful that we will get TPA passed, perhaps even this week. And again, just to talk about Trade Promotion Authority, our Congress is now debating it. It's currently in the House. It's being debated in the House at this point, and it would allow us to conclude a TPP agreement. And again, the impact of this agreement would integrate countries with economies totaling $28 trillion, which is a pretty big amount of trade. Just a quick overview of where we're at in terms of House trade votes, our House of Representatives, and where we've been in the past history of all of our free trade agreements. Just looking at the split of Republican and Democratic votes, and 215 is essentially the number of votes that are needed to form a majority in the House of Representatives to pass any type of bill. And as you can see, in fact, all of these free trade agreements have been passed by the House of Representatives. And as you can see, it's essentially been a bipartisan vote. Both Republicans and Democrats have joined together to pass these trade agreements. Just to look very briefly at the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement, which was signed 10 years ago, as mentioned. I think the most immediate impact was the elimination of all Australian tariffs on U.S. agricultural products. And most tariffs in the United States were eliminated, although there were some particularly sensitive products that have been phased out or are being phased out over a transition period of 18 years. And also, all U.S. quotas will be eliminated after a transition period. And yes, in parentheses, I have raw cane sugar and some dairy products, which of course is an issue between Australia and the United States in the TPP negotiations right now. So with that said, the U.S. and Australia, I must emphasize that we are some of the closest allies, not only on security issues, but also economic. And really, despite perhaps some of the issues we have in these trade agreements, we are really one of the most cooperative bilateral relationships that I have seen in my years as a diplomat in the Foreign Service. And one of the issues is the free trade agreement, which has freed 99% of all trade. And frankly, total trade is up 80% since this agreement was instituted. Both Australia and the United States have benefited tremendously from this agreement. And again, just to point out also that the U.S., as many of you are aware, is the largest foreign investor in Australia, and Australia has a significant investment in the United States as well. Some of the benefits from the free trade agreement for Australia, again, the beef quota which has been increased, and there's no in-quota duty on this quota. And this is continuing to expand. Again, there is some issue about expanding the quota, the total quota again, but this is something that's being discussed right now, or being talked about at least. In-quota tariffs on dairy products have been removed, and duty-free access is for 99% of all horticultural products as well. And again, since January 2015, we're planning to further liberalize and remove remaining U.S. tariffs on wine and increase the duty-free tariff quotas for beef, dairy, cotton, peanuts, and avocados. And just a quick graph of major Australian exports to the U.S. market. Clearly, red meat is a very important and growing market for Australia. And frankly, I mentioned this morning to somebody that really the only thing stopping further expansion in the beef market for Australia is the supply situation here in Australia. I think the sky's the limit in terms of the U.S. market. Wine and beer, although there have been some declines, very slight declines over the last year. I mean, wine and beer, the wine and beer market is steady and essentially increasing for Australia. And then again, some intermediate products are important for Australia as well. And U.S. agricultural exports to Australia, just to throw that in over the last 4 years. In fact, one of our biggest markets in Australia is pork, and we'd like to see that expanded somewhat. But we're also exporting a lot of dairy products, some cheeses. We have a very excellent counter-seasonal market for fresh fruit and vegetables in Australia, which I like to emphasize, frankly, because I don't know whether a lot, especially the consumer, they don't realize that, yes, there may be some overlap and some marginal competition in this area, but essentially it's a counter-seasonal market where everybody is a winner. I mean, Australia and U.S. producers as well as consumers, because it's essentially in a market where we're not really directly competing, and we're able to enjoy fresh fruits and vegetables year-round. So it's a really important market for both countries. And of course, I can't go without mentioning the distilled spirits market. We're very big on Jack Daniel's and Maker's Mark and all of those good whiskeys, which are really growing in popularity here in Australia and around the world, frankly. Just a few remaining issues between the U.S. and Australia, as well as some resolved issues. Again, quarantine is something that is really important here in Australia. It's important in the United States as well. And I always like to preface my remarks by saying countries have the right, the duty, and the obligation to protect their human, animal, and plant health by, I mean, no stretch of the imagination, full stop. But at the same time, we want to make sure that quarantine issues and policies are based on sound science and allow trade to take place if the science enables it. And there are issues that the United States is concerned about in terms of market access with Australia, including U.S. beef, as well as apples, pork, and turkey meat. Australia, of course, also has issues with the United States, which includes citrus. Judith is well aware of that, but also stone fruit. Honeybees is actually an issue for Australia that's come to the fore recently. The market right now in the United States for honeybees is currently closed, but there's a big demand for honeybees in the U.S. We've had some problems with our populations there, and Australia has the bee populations at this point, and we're working to get that market open. Another very controversial issue is bovine tuberculosis. The United States has not declared Australia free of bovine TB at this point, although it's again something that we are working very hard at USDA to try and resolve it as quickly as possible. There's a bureaucratic and regulatory process that we need to move through, but it's something that we are moving forward as fast as we possibly can. Biotechnology issues, that was already addressed today. Obviously, it's a mixed bag in Australia. That's how I would characterize it. It's obviously depending on the state as to how biotechnology policy is promulgated. But I don't want to leave this slide without talking about some of the issues that we have resolved, both countries, including for the U.S. We've recently opened the stone fruit market here in Australia, peaches, nectarines, and now plums. That's an important market for California producers. As well, I talk about the beef market here in Australia. We're making some progress. In fact, just recently, we've had some very good progress in terms of a report that was issued by your food safety agency that's going to help open the market for heat-treated beef products, and that's the type of beef that goes into things like canned chilies and other prepared products. On the Australia side, you've had a we're very happy to have this market open as well for Australia mango producers and lychee producers. That's actually, I've heard reports that the mango market is going crazy in the United States, and you're selling a lot of mangoes in the U.S., so that's a very important and positive development for Australian mango exporters. So just to round this out, opportunities remain for Australia in the large U.S. import market. Overall, food imports to the U.S. continue to increase, and the Australia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement is basically guaranteed access for Australia, and there are further opportunities to diversify exports. Again, just a quick overview of our import share of U.S. food consumption. Again, a lot of complementary type products, but including wine and fresh fruits and vegetables, and we should have some beef. We should have beef on there as well. Concluding comments, again, opportunities for Australia food and agriculture into the world markets, especially if trade policy initiatives succeed. The U.S. market is a great opportunity, important opportunity for Australia, especially in the wake of the Free Trade Agreement. And again, I want to mention that Australia and the U.S. are two of the most cooperative nations when it comes to investment, when it comes to research and development, cooperation on biosecurity, and we have a very strong overall bilateral relationship, which I'm very happy to report on. And that basically wraps it up.